James Todaro received his medical degree from the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York. He leads investigative research in COVID-19 on a global scale. He wrote the first widely read paper on chloroquine in treatment of COVID-19 in an effective treatment for coronavirus, and most recently, the first detailed expose on Surgisphere in a study out of thin air. His early discovery of the fraudulent data investigation led to what is now referred to as LancetGate, the stunning once-in-a-generation retraction of the now infamous The Lancet study that had led to the European Union and the World Health Organization halting studies of hydroxychloroquine. It is due to physicians like Dr. Todaro that we're able to see with clear eyes what's really happening. Thank you, Dr. Todaro.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, over this past year, the COVID-19 pandemic has really exposed or uncovered a tremendous amount of corruption and conflicts of interest that are in both the health sciences and medical fields. And for my talk today, I'm going to go through different levels of these organizations, looking at these financial incentives and why we see so many of these health officials and organizations pushing a similar narrative. Fear and panic with the only way to get back to a real normal, not the new normal, a real normal, vaccine or a big pharma therapeutic. I think perhaps the best place to start is with the model, the prediction model, that projected so many millions of deaths globally from this pandemic that never came to fruition. And that's a model that was put forth by a British epidemiologist, Dr. Neil Ferguson. He took a relatively small number of cases, calculated an infection fatality rate, and then expanded that to each nation, projecting how many deaths they'd see. This was done in early March, right when countries were deciding, nations' leaders were deciding to issue lockdowns or not. And his model projected that the US would have 2.2 million deaths in a relatively short period of time. The United Kingdom would have 500,000 deaths. Sweden would have almost 100,000 deaths from COVID-19. Now, almost a year into the pandemic, the US is at 220,000 deaths. The United Kingdom is at about 43,000 deaths. Sweden is at 6,000 deaths. Now remember, Sweden did not institute masks or lockdowns, so their numbers should have even gotten much more closer to Dr. Ferguson's projections, but it did not. Now, Dr. Ferguson has a history of making these astronomical projections. He did so for the swine flu back in 2009, which indeed had a lot of infections, a very low number of fatalities. So I did some digging into Dr. Ferguson. What is the kind of reason? What's the incentive? Is it fame, fortune? Why did he create this number that was over tenfold off in nations around the world? And there's always a fame element. He got a lot of attention. He was the one that they used his model to shut down across Europe, the United States. Then I looked into the fortune side of things, which is always very tough to actually uncover because so much of this information is not publicly accessible. But supposedly, from what I saw, he withdrew from a number of his financial interests in big pharma companies back in 2007. But I think there's an important thing to note with these health officials, and I'll talk about a couple more coming up. But oftentimes when they have this position of authority, they transition later to board seats on big pharma companies, to consultant positions. And I think a prime example, so I don't know if Dr. Ferguson is going to have that because there was a whole scandal where he kind of broke his own lockdown advice and had to resign. But I think a good case in point would be Scott Gottlieb. So many of you may be familiar with his name. He's often, his comments are used by the mainstream media to support this idea of a new normal until we have either a big pharma therapeutic or vaccine. But he's a former FDA commissioner as recently as 2019. And within months of leaving his position with the FDA, he had board seats on about 4 or 5 different pharmaceutical companies, including Pfizer, and many other relationships with pharmaceutical companies. So he's putting out information that is directly benefiting the companies he sits as a board member of. I would be remiss not to at least mention Dr. Fauci, since he had such an influence in the early months of this pandemic. And to really uncover real corruption there is incredibly challenging. I know there's people that have far more resources than I do that are actually actively, just in the past month or so, gathering information through requests to the government to release documents between Dr. Fauci and the World Health Organization, so hopefully something will come of that. But I do want to comment on it. This isn't the first pandemic Dr. Fauci has gone through. He's been in this position a very long time. And if you look all the way back to the AIDS epidemic back in the late 1980s, there's some similarities to the pandemic today. It was brought to Dr. Fauci's attention in 1987 that an antibiotic called Bactrim would help prevent the onset of pneumocystis pneumonia, PCP, in patients with AIDS. And these were frontline doctors that were giving this information to Dr. Fauci. He dismissed it and said there wasn't enough evidence. Instead, he looked and paid attention to newer drugs, novel therapies, something that was just patented. It took 2 years before Bactrim was then included in the guidelines as a prophylactic in HIV patients to prevent the onset of pneumonia. Thousands upon thousands of patients suffocated to death in the meantime, in those 2 years, because it was not a recommended therapy. If that sounds a little familiar to some of Dr. Fauci's comments on other medications during this pandemic, it does. He did a similar attitude toward hydroxychloroquine, and hopefully we don't have to wait 2 years to have a verdict on that and have that instituted in guidelines. Moving from these health officials to the World Health Organization, I think that anyone that is looking at the World Health Organization with an open mind can see that they pushed a certain narrative that is against the science oftentimes. When it comes to therapeutics, there was sufficient evidence in February of this year that hydroxychloroquine needed to be explored as an effective treatment for COVID-19 efficiently and in an effective way. And they had ignored it for months. They ignored all the in vitro evidence that it was effective. They ignored the evidence coming out of Asia and south of France that it was effective. And so whether you believe hydroxychloroquine works or not, whether you think there's sufficient evidence or not, I think everyone would say that it was in the world's best interest to study this medication early to determine whether it is an effective therapy or not to save lives. And they really dropped the ball on that, including the NIH. The other kind of non-science thing that the World Health Organization does is they create this idea of kind of fear and panic, that we have a new normal, all right? And they did the similar thing with the swine flu back in 2009. There was more deaths from this one, but it's a similar idea. And it's very interesting. Just about last week, they announced that the number of infections in the world approached about 10%. So 10% of the globe was infected by SARS-CoV-2 at some point. If you do the math on that, it's about 780 million people. There's been a million deaths from COVID-19. So if you do some simple math, you get an infection fatality rate of about 0.13%. The World Health Organization won't say that. They'll throw out this 10% of the world's infected number. We know the number of deaths, many of which probably died with COVID as opposed to from COVID, but even counting those deaths, it comes with an infection fatality rate of 0.13%, which is very far from that 0.6% that they're still quoting. To again uncover the World Health Organizations if there's corruption or not, it's very difficult, but I think from everything that we've seen them produce, there is an incentive there, and I've heard theories where they're relating to Bill Gates and a vaccine, relating to China's influence over them, or maybe it's just to keep themselves relevant. I mean, I don't know if we've ever talked about the World Health Organization this much over a short period of time. The NIH is a little bit more transparent in the conflicts of interest. I remember during the peak of the remdesivir hype, so remdesivir is a big pharmaceutical coming from Gilead, which is a big pharma company. During the peak of that excitement, the NIH COVID-19 Task Force panel, so this is the panel that makes the decisions on which medications are recommended and considered effective for COVID-19. 20% of that panel consisted of people that had a conflict of interest with Gilead, financial interest in them. So you literally have the people making the decisions, making the recommendations for these therapies that have a direct incentive for these to get passed because they're going to profit off those medications. To move from the NIH, I'd say, the gatekeepers for the science overall. So the NIH, the World Health Organization, the gatekeepers are really the academic journals themselves, though. Okay, they're supposed to be the ones with robust peer review processes to vet the science, to make sure it's valid and true science. all right, with valid conclusions that are derived from the science. And what we've seen is an unprecedented on corruption within those academic journals. In the past 6 months, 2 of the top medical journals in the world, The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, produced openly fraudulent studies that benefited Big Pharma. The Lancet did their study that dismissed hydroxychloroquine as dangerous, which was retracted just two weeks later. New England Journal of Medicine put out a study that benefited cardiovascular drugs, pharmaceuticals. That was also retracted. Now for studies published in these top medical journals that had this much impact on global health policies and treatments to be retracted for fraudulent data is really unprecedented. It's not just publishing fraudulent data, but they're blocking data that doesn't fit their narrative. Right? How many journals have you seen a hydroxychloroquine article that is really supportive of it been in a top journal? They often won't accept it. I've talked to a number of researchers that complain about this, where the science is there, the evidence is there, but the journal won't publish it. But it's not just hydroxychloroquine. It actually goes into even evidence for lockdowns and herd immunity. There's a great article that was written by a biomathematician, along with her colleagues, where it basically took a look at through a mathematical model on why so many regions of the world had about 20% infected based on antibody testing, and then deaths begin to decline. And in any of those areas that really hit that 20% mark, we've yet to see deaths even come close to their previous peak. And this is for Lombardy, New York City, London, Madrid, even in the US at a whole different time, so not March and April, but Florida, in some of the major areas. Once the antibody testing hit about 20%, we saw deaths begin to decline, and they've yet to ever reach that number again. She wrote this article that included all this, and it wasn't published in any academic journal. She had to release it as a preprint, which means it's not essentially peer-reviewed because they all rejected it. And she was fairly transparent with why they rejected it. She actually provided a quote from one of the academic journals saying why the article wasn't accepted. And it was basically this, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was this article that will give people the idea that they can go out into the world with less caution. All right? God forbid. And so we have these academic journals who are supposed to be the gatekeepers to science, who are producing fraudulent data that fits their narrative, and then censoring or stopping any content. And this is an academic journal where it should be for the search of truth in science, regardless of public opinion. It should not be in their minds like, oh, well, how will the public perceive this? This is supposed to be the one place where you can actually look at true science. I'm wrapping up here, but I want to talk for just a couple minutes on the mainstream media's role in this pandemic. And we've all seen the large role they've played. Mainstream media, along with the academic journals, receives a substantial amount of money through advertising and sponsorships with big pharmaceutical companies. So it makes sense that they're going along with this narrative. The waters are kind of muddied a bit with politics given the election year as well. But what we're seeing with the mainstream media is really either something that was never noticed before or is kind of unprecedented degree of corruption where they're literally rewriting history. Just earlier this week, I tweeted out an article, it was a 2010 article in Forbes magazine, which the author was talking about, it was a scathing review of the World Health Organization and how they over-exaggerated the swine flu pandemic, okay? And then the author said that in his scathing review, even the mildest of pandemics has at least 1 million deaths, okay? Not to mean that 1 million deaths isn't a lot and every death matters. Most of us here are physicians, and so that's critically important. But from a global health policy, according to that Forbes author, even the mildest pandemics of the last 100 years had at least 1 million deaths. As we just heard, COVID-19 just passed 1 million deaths. So according to that Forbes author, it just now qualifies as a mild pandemic. So I tweeted this out. It got a couple hundred thousand views. By the next morning, the article was deleted. Forbes erased the article. The link no longer existed. Overnight, over 12 hours. And that's what we're seeing in these organizations is no accountability. They're taking any of the history that doesn't fit the narrative today and erasing it. It's really essentially straight out of George Orwell's 1984. Now, it's very easy to participate in this pandemic and say kind of a couple things, state your case, and then step away and say, well, I'll be shown right in the end. It's very tempting to do that. But what I'll say is kind of the call to action is we have to be more aggressive than that. We have to be louder than that. We have to be persistent. Because if we're too quiet, they will change history. They won't hear this. And we have a chance now to save American lives and save the American economy. Thank you.
I just want to make sure people have actually heard what you said. When I first heard you say this, I thought perhaps you were saying that you were censored. But again, you were saying that Forbes magazine actually took down their own article.
They had an article up for 10 years on their website. And 12 hours after I tweeted, they decided that the article no longer should exist.
Wow.
Americans, we need to wake up. Thank you so much.